God versus Nature: The Conflict Between Religion and Science in History. Chapter 8: The Scientific Revolution. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was a defining moment in the history of Western civilization. Modern science and the scientific method were born. The rate of scientific discovery exploded. Giants such as Copernicus, Vesalius, Kepler, Galileo, Harvey, and Newton, as well as countless lesser figures, unlocked world-changing secrets of the universe. It has often been observed that such a revolution occurred only once in human history and in one particular culture, the predominantly Christian culture of early modern Europe. This observation gives rise to several questions. What role, if any, did Christianity play in the birth of modern science? Did faith give rise to science? Did a mixture of faith and reason give rise to it? Was Christianity somehow responsible or even necessary for the rise of modern science, as some historians have argued? In short, what, if anything, does God have to do with the scientific revolution? As long as science has existed, religionists have been attempting to reconcile religion and science. But recently, a new breed of scholars has asserted that religion itself, Christianity in particular, actually caused the birth of science. What are the facts of the matter? The bulk of this chapter will deal with these issues. Before turning to them, we will first take an overview of the main developments of the scientific revolution. The following sections will examine several significant changes, integral to the scientific revolution, that were occurring regarding the way people viewed science and religion. The scientific revolution: key developments. The year 1543 saw the publication of two monumentally important scientific works, and for that reason it is often considered the beginning of the scientific revolution. The first was Andreas Vesalius's On the Structure of the Human Body, which, with its astounding illustrations, founded the modern study of anatomy. Vesalius, a trained physician, was deeply influenced by the naturalism of the Renaissance, by the idea that the natural world merits our careful study. This led him to perform meticulous dissections of human cadavers and to hire an accomplished Renaissance artist to create the fabulously detailed woodcut illustrations for his book. The work of Vesalius inspired many followers who later made important anatomical and physiological discoveries. But even more significant than Vesalius's book, as we've seen in the previous chapter, was Nicholas Copernicus's On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, published that same year. The heliocentric system of Copernicus formed the first link in a chain of astronomical observations, reasoning, and discoveries that included those of such great scientists as Tycho Brahe, Johannes Kepler, and Galileo Galilei, and which culminated in a grand synthesis on the part of Isaac Newton with his universal law of gravitation. This chain of discoveries would not have been possible without Galileo's brilliant experimental investigations into the nature of free fall using pendulums and inclined planes. Galileo's contemporaries, William Gilbert and Francis Bacon, also focused on the idea of systematic experimentation as the key to understanding natural phenomena. As the 17th century progressed, belief in the power of experimentation became widespread, and scientists invented new precision tools for performing observations and experiments. These instruments included the telescope, microscope, barometer, thermometer, precision clock, and vacuum pump. Galileo was the first of many brilliant experimentalists who found ingenious ways of investigating the properties of nature. One of these men, Robert Boyle, used the barometer and vacuum pump to discover the exact relationship between the volume of gas and the pressure exerted on it, known today as Boyle's law. He also subjected alchemical ideas to systematic experimentation and rational analysis, and is thus considered one of the forefathers of the science of chemistry. These new scientists were eager to share their ideas with like-minded others, and soon conceived of an entirely new type of social organization, the scientific society. Scientific societies in Italy, France, England, and elsewhere made it much easier for scientists to meet and discuss their work, to perform experiments, and to report on scientific work done in other countries. The earliest scientific society to which Galileo belonged was the Accademia dei Lincei, Academy of the Lynx, in Rome, which was succeeded by the more formal Accademia del Cimento, Academy of Experiment. By the 1660s, royally sponsored societies had been founded in France, the Académie Royale des Sciences, and England, the Royal Society of London, and both had official journals for the publication of research done by their members. The sciences most fundamental to the scientific revolution were astronomy and physics, but scientists also made significant discoveries regarding the nature of living things. That blood circulates through the body, that reproduction begins with the union of egg and sperm, that sexual reproduction occurs in plants, and that life functions could be viewed as analogs of physical and chemical processes. The most important discovery of the scientific revolution was the powerful new method of discovery itself. The modern scientific method relied on a combination of careful observation, controlled experiments, and the search for mathematical laws and their relationships. Historian of science I.B. Cohen points out, quote, how novel and revolutionary it was to discover principles by experiment combined with mathematical analysis, to set scientific laws in the context of experience, and to test the validity of knowledge by making an experimental test. Traditionally, knowledge had been based on faith and insight, on reason detached from observation and revelation. The new science discarded all of these as ways of understanding nature and set up experience, experiment and critical observation as the foundation and ultimate test of knowledge. Unquote. This new method was ultimately an extension of Aristotle's basic philosophical orientation, his this-worldly metaphysics, and his epistemology of reason. Unfortunately, Aristotle's specific theories about physics and cosmology, such as his explanation of why heavy objects fall, proved to be incorrect. Also, a number of scholastic philosophers insisted on the truth of these Aristotelian theories even in the face of new observational evidence against them. As a result, many 17th century scientists formed a highly negative judgment of Aristotle, even as they accepted his basic philosophical orientation. As scientists such as Galileo and William Harvey pointed out, Aristotle had argued that all science must be tied to careful observation of the world. Philosophically, Aristotle's primacy of existence was the foundation of the scientific revolution, and it was owing to Thomas Aquinas that Aristotle's ideas were back on the scene. Making Room for Reason, God's Two Books. During the scientific revolution, there was little explicit conflict between science and religion, apart from Galileo's famous clash with the Roman Inquisition. Scientists generally adopted, or at least did not openly reject, the religious views of their culture. However, there was a significant reorientation between science and religion, in which people reconceived God as playing a much smaller role in the universe. One key to this reorientation was the metaphor of God's two books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature, which were considered equally deserving of our attention. This metaphor originated in Thomas Aquinas' distinction between the realms of faith and reason, and was famously promoted in the 17th century by Francis Bacon. Quote, "Let no man upon a weak conceit of sobriety, or an ill-applied moderation, think or maintain that a man can search too far, or be too well studied in the book of God's Word, or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy, but rather let men endeavor in endless progress or proficience in both. Only let men beware that they do not unwisely mingle or confound these learnings together." Unquote. Bacon's warning about mingling the two books became highly influential among his many 17th century followers, and became widely accepted that God's two books should be studied quite separately. As far as religious belief was concerned, Bacon urged men to, quote, "give to faith only that which is faith's," unquote. This attitude was liberating for scientific work, keeping it largely unmolested by religion. The opposite attitude, that religion is closely connected with the study of the physical world, had led to the Church's persecution of Galileo. He had advocated an idea that the earth moves that conflicted with biblical passages implying that the earth does not move. Bacon's writings were influential throughout the new scientific societies in Europe, but they were especially so in England, where the founders of the Royal Society of London referenced them explicitly. As a result of this influence, at the Royal Society, quote, "no one ever presented a public case for a scientific fact with a theological argument," unquote. Historians have often pointed out that many of the 17th century English scientists had careers in the Church. But even these theologian scientists sought to isolate their religious beliefs from their scientific studies, in effect leading double lives. Quote, "English scientists qua scientists kept out of the sacristy. English theologians qua theologians kept out of the rooms where experiments were performed." Unquote. Among the accomplished scientists, the two figures most famous for their strong religious beliefs were Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton. But even these two were careful to keep a separation between God's two books. According to one historian, quote, "when working as a naturalist, Boyle sought to, quote, discourse of natural things, unquote, only, without intermeddling with supernatural mysteries," unquote. Newton wrote extensively on religion, but his scientific books contained no religious arguments for his scientific conclusions. And when he was president of the Royal Society, quote, he banned anything remotely touching on religion, unquote. The Clockwork Universe. Around the year 1600, when astronomers Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler came to Prague to accept employment from Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, they could not have failed to notice Prague's great astronomical clock. Mechanical clocks had started appearing in Europe in the late 13th century and had become widespread in larger cities by the mid-14th century. The first clocks had their innards exposed, so everyone could easily see how they worked. By the 16th century, clocks were generally built to conceal their inner workings. Many clocks, such as the ones in Prague and Strasbourg, did much more than just tell time. They indicated solar and lunar cycles and marked key moments with startling animations such as crowing roosters and jousting knights. The inside of a clock involved extremely complex motions that could even appear purposeful. This led some to start thinking that perhaps the entire cosmos was like this in some way. During the 17th century, people began seeing nature as essentially similar to a machine, and the clock became a favorite metaphor. In reaction to the natural magic tradition of the Renaissance, with its sympathies and antipathies and occult powers, the new view considered nature as a machine made up of unconscious material parts controlled by external mechanical forces. In its extreme form, this led to the idea that all the phenomena of nature are produced by particles of matter in motion. When Robert Hooke looked at insects under the microscope, he was amazed at the intricate details he saw. These made him think of the insects as complex machines. Robert Boyle, one of the greatest champions of this new way of looking at the world, called it the mechanical philosophy. The adherents of the mechanical philosophy had a variety of opinions about the nature of matter and mechanical forces. Catholic priest Pierre Gassendi followed the atomist tradition from Democritus of ancient Greece, which held that all matter is composed of indivisible solid particles. Others, such as René Descartes, believed that matter is infinitely divisible. Some saw matter as entirely inert, and others saw it as having some active capacities. While Newton's law of gravity operated without direct physical contact between objects, and was disputed by some for that reason, it was seen by others as still essentially keeping to the mechanical tradition. From its first formulations, the mechanical philosophy invited charges of atheism because it suggested that the world machine could run itself without the external help of a god. In defense of their piety, its proponents always stressed that they saw God as the creator and constant operator of this machine. Invoking the distinction between primary and secondary causes, as the Mutazilites had done centuries earlier, they explained that God was, of course, the primary cause of all events, and that they were studying secondary mechanical causes. In this way, they gradually came to see God less and less as an explanation for anything. As the culmination of the scientific revolution, Newton's mathematical principles of natural philosophy demonstrated that the world works on essentially mechanical principles understandable by human beings. Although for Newton, God was still there actively adjusting and supporting the universe in its operations, many of his successors held that once the universe was up and running, it shouldn't require outside intervention. Natural theology displaces revealed theology. When Thomas Aquinas claimed that there were theological truths that could be established by reason alone, he created the field of natural theology. Aquinas argued that reason, and thus natural theology, could prove the existence of God and several of God's characteristics. For the rest of the essential truths of Christianity, one needed to turn to revealed theology, the domain of faith, revelations, and the Bible. Revealed theology was necessary to establish the central doctrines of Christianity, such as the Trinity and Christ's role as Redeemer for our sins. The study of natural theology became popular in the 17th century, especially among English theologians. Many of the 17th century scientists were excited about the discoveries they were making, and they associated this excitement and wonder with religious feeling. Robert Hooke expressed a common view. Quote, "'Tis the contemplation of the wonderful order, law, and power of that we call nature that does most magnify the beauty and excellency of the divine providence, which has so disposed, ordered, adapted, and empowered each part so as to operate as to produce the wonderful effects which we see. I say wonderful because every natural production may be truly said to be a wonder or miracle if duly considered." Unquote. Another Royal Society member spoke about, quote, "the lawful and religious delight which should result from beholding the curious and wonderful frame of this our visible world." Unquote. By the year 1700, natural theology had become so popular that it displaced much of revealed theology. Robert Boyle, whose religiosity has already been noted, was one of the greatest champions of natural theology among the accomplished scientists of the era. He wrote voluminously about how science proved the greatness of God and how scientific research was a form of worship. And his book, The Christian Virtuoso, where virtuoso meant scientist, described how doing science makes a man a better Christian. Although Boyle was no doubt sincere in his profession of religious belief, historian Richard Westphal has noted a major omission in Boyle's writings. For all his professed devotion to Christianity, Boyle barely mentioned Christ and essentially ignored the core doctrine of his religion. Quote, "The scarcity of references to Christ in the many pages of Boyle's disquisitions on religion is striking. The idea of redemption did not play an important role in his thought on moral living. He considered the attainment of virtue as an intellectual choice dependent on a person's comprehension of God. The problems of morality were not pressing concerns in his personal life. He talked about sin like an American discussing cricket. He had heard about it, but had never seen it close at hand. The Christian doctrine of redemption rang no response in his soul." Unquote. The shift of intellectual focus from revealed theology to natural theology was a step away from the Christian God and toward the deist God, which in turn was only one step away from a universe devoid of the supernatural. Bearing in mind the key developments leading up to and during the scientific revolution, the prevailing religious attitudes of its scientists, and the gradual waning of God as an explanation for nature, we can return to a question raised at the outset of this chapter. Was Christianity necessary for the birth of modern science? In recent decades, academic historians of science have rejected the idea that science and religion are incompatible, and they have written volumes in an effort to refute what they call the conflict thesis, the idea that science and religion are fundamentally in conflict. See the appendix for the history of the conflict thesis. These historians have also acted as enablers for die-hard religionists to argue that religion caused the birth of science. These religionists include the prolific Stanley Jackie, Benedictine priest and professor of physics, Ian Barbour, professor of religion and physics, Thomas Woods, a popular libertarian Catholic writer, and Rodney Stark, a sociologist of religion at Baylor University. Stark, the most prominent contemporary proponent of this view, devotes a chapter of his book, For the Glory of God, to the idea that Christianity laid the philosophical groundwork for the development of modern science, writing, quote, "Christianity depicted God as a rational, responsive, dependable, and omnipotent being, and the universe as his personal creation, thus having a rational, lawful, stable structure awaiting human comprehension." Unquote. Although many of the 17th century scientists had such a conception of God and the universe, this is no ground for attributing the rise of science to Christianity. Scientists were not studying the supernatural realm. They were studying observable nature, the identity of things, and causal relationships. They were employing not faith, but reason, observation, logic. Had scientists tried to ground science in religion, they would have been utterly stifled. Where would they have turned? To God? He can't be observed. This is both a tenet of religion and a simple fact. The only place scientists could have turned to ground science in religion is the Bible. What would they have found there? The Bible certainly does not present God as, quote, rational, responsive, and dependable, unquote, or the universe as, quote, having a rational, lawful, stable structure, unquote, that is open to, quote, human comprehension, unquote. The Old Testament presents the natural world as created by a supernatural being who frequently acts to intervene in his creation, to make things act in contradiction to their natures, by, for instance, stopping the sun and moon from moving, turning a woman into salt, and making a bush speak. Likewise, the New Testament presents a world full of supernatural, unscientific, causally impossible events, from Mary being impregnated by a ghost, to Jesus walking on water, to a dead man rising from the grave. And this is to say nothing of the moral atrocities perpetrated by God in the Bible, from his exterminating most of the human race in a flood to his torturing Job. The whole Christian worldview entails the subordination of reality, identity, and causality to the whims of an alleged God for whom there is no evidence and who is therefore to be accepted on faith. Why, then, did 17th century scientists think of God as rational if they had not have gotten this idea from the Bible? The conception of a rational God, a God that somehow fit with nature, was a projection of their own minds that were beginning to embrace a rational view of the world, and thus turning away from the philosophical and literary core of Christianity. After Aquinas introduced Aristotelian principles to the Christian world, Christian culture acted as a carrier of the pro-reason, pro-reality philosophy. Aristotle's philosophy was always at odds with the supernatural and mystical core of Christianity, which is why Aquinas himself had to divide knowledge into two separate realms. In spite of its historical longevity, Aquinas' theology was always an unstable amalgam of contradictory components, one of which is the foundation of science, the other of which contradicts it. Modern science was born in a culture in which Christianity was the dominant religion, but modern science was not built on a Christian foundation. It was built on the implicit foundation provided by the pro-reason primacy of existence philosophy of Aristotle. The great discoveries of the scientific revolution demonstrated the awesome power of the human rational mind. Since the fall of Rome, Christianity had dominated all cultural and intellectual activity in the West. But by the end of the 17th century, Christianity had lost its dominance in the realm of the intellect, and science had become the primary source of inspiration for those eager to use their minds. Although explicit religious belief remained at high levels among the new scientists, it moved from the foreground to the background of their minds. Aquinas had segregated religion from reason, enabling reason to flourish. Revealed theology, true religion, was displaced by natural theology, dramatically loosening the shackles of religion and inspiring people to observe reality and think. The universe was increasingly seen as a machine that God had designed and then left alone, enabling us, through reason, to discover the laws of nature and to transform the world to suit our needs. A vestigial God remained as an explanation of the universe, but future generations would realize that God was not needed as an explanation for anything at all. The claim of today's religious apologists that the scientific revolution is rooted in religion, that science somehow came from faith, is historically and logically absurd. The foundation and cause of the scientific revolution was not religion or faith, but observation and logic. In Chapter 5, we saw how the Renaissance caused the primacy of consciousness to lose strength. The scientific revolution entailed a further shift in mental attitude, away from the primacy of consciousness and toward the primacy of existence.